I will. Great. So what I want to talk about today is proven ways to fund large-scale systems transformation. And the gap that I'm going to talk about today that's on my heart, there are many, as you named in the chat, but the one I want to talk about today is closing the $9 trillion climate funding gap. It's really 9 trillion plus that's needed to close to get the climate action solutions going that we need. And Dhruv, I can't see the chat, so just let me know if there's a question in there along the way.
Sure.
So
I'm just directing attendees to use the Q&A tab to record their questions or comments, and then we'll get to them one by one after you're done with your presentation.
Very good. So just to let you know what to expect, I am going to present a lot, but I'm going to pause for questions at points, so do use that question box. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and how I came to this work. And then secondly, how can we close that funding gap and use it, use the climate funding gap as, in your mind as any gap that you're focused on. And we're going to do that in 3 steps. We're going to answer the question, where does money come from? We're going to ask how money creation is funding harms today, or what is it funding today? And then how can it be redirected into closing funding gaps? And again, I'm going to use climate solutions today as the case study. So just quickly about me, I am a master's student at Duke University in their Graduate and Liberal Studies program, which is a interdisciplinary master's, and there I research the social, economic, and ecological impact of money systems. I'll say in just a moment what that's about. I'm also the research lead for the Money Justice Collaborative. We are a nonprofit project in the United States that brings information about money creation and money systems to social movement organizations so that they can incorporate it in their strategies. So what am I talking about in money systems? Here I'm talking about national currencies, national money systems. And by a system, what I mean is the laws and institutions that determine how each additional dollar or euro or yen gets created and added to circulation. So that is the answers to questions like, who creates it? For what purposes? For whose benefit? When, where, and how much? And if you think about any national money system, really any money system throughout history, if there's money in existence, these questions were answered, right? Somebody created it and for some purpose, and they did it in some time and place. And so, why do I study this? Is because I'm interested in how do those decisions that are being made today impact society, the economy, and the environment. And really, I got tipped to this topic because I ran across people in research who are saying the way money is created today is really important because it is intensifying many of the problems that we're experiencing. The way money is created today is intensifying inequality and poverty. It is driving our housing crisis and household debt burdens. It is actually fueling right-wing extremism that is anti-democratic, believe it or not, the way money is created is. And I'm not going to have time to go into today each of the ways that the research shows that these things are true, but just to say that it is tied to a lot of things. And if you think about just the fact that money is involved in nearly every issue because it is part of what gets funded and what doesn't, and what is whether it's funding harms or it's funding solutions, it makes sense maybe that money and money creation could be touching so many different issues. The other thing that these researchers and experts are saying is that changing how money is created in our national money systems today is a huge point of leverage for making positive change. For example, some of you may know Jason Hickel. He's a famous author in degrowth and post-growth sustainability. And he says, as it turns out, reinventing our money system is crucial to our survival in the Anthropocene, at least as important as getting off of fossil fuels. Right? So I want to be super clear. None of these folks are saying that this is a cure-all. What they're saying is that it is a lever for making change. And the experts that I just showed you, they're just part of a growing global movement of activists, academics, and even insiders to the banking and central banking that are increasingly calling attention to this aspect of our problem. And so we're going to get into that in some detail. But just to, again, say that the problem that's on my heart, among many others, is that currently we are on path to 3 degrees global warming by 2100. And scientists tell us that that would make much of Earth uninhabitable. So what we also know is that that in order to avoid that, we need to make huge investments in clean energy, in energy efficiency, in climate adaptation. And just one of the numbers that's been put on that by the Climate Policy Initiative is that we need to find $9 trillion per year in climate funding. Now, just to put trillion dollars in perspective, $1 trillion is $1 million per day for 2,500 years. As in, if you spent $1 million per day for 2,500 years, you will not have spent $1 trillion. So we're talking about huge sums of money that we need to find. And so one of the options is fiscal policy, which is taxing and borrowing. But as you know, many governments are tapped out. And sure, they could increase taxes, but let's say you're in a country that already has a very high tax rate, 50% or something like that. If you need to triple or maybe even 10 times grow your investment in the fossil fuel industry, you don't have the room to grow your tax base by that much. And in another solution is private investment, and this is promoted a lot as green bonds or environmentally social governance investing. But that idea has been promoted for 20 years, and it's not delivering the goods. So what's another option? Another option is to create money for funding climate solutions. And this can be done in a number of different ways. Just two of them that are just to give you some keywords that you could search with is credit policy and monetary financing. If you wanted to start going down this rabbit hole, those are two that get into the solutions. I will be happy to give you some papers that specifically connect those to sustainability and climate. I accidentally did not include the slide that has that list of papers, but those two terms will get you started. And one of the things that some of those papers will show you is that this has been done before. The ability to scale up huge change, whether it's getting us out of the Great Depression or funding the transformation of our entire economy to full employment, maximum output for the mobilization for World War II in a matter of a few years by taking, for example, in the United States, the federal budget of the United States and making it 10 times larger than it was at the beginning of the war in just a couple of years, right? So, fiscal policy really can't do that. You can't just take the tax bracket and just 10x it. But that is what we did, not only in World War II, but also in funding the social safety net, massive construction of universities, and so on post-war. So that's in the United States. In Germany, they took a slightly different approach. Also built one of the strongest economies in the world, particularly super strong with small businesses that are world leading, and they did it in a different way. And then China, some of you may know, in the 1990s has taken off in this massive, unbelievable Chinese miracle economic growth. And they did that in another way, also by harnessing money creation. And just in the last few years, they have used that to install just an unbelievable amount of clean energy to the point where in 2024, their carbon emissions began to decline, which is unprecedented for such a large economy today. So we're going to answer 3 questions, as I told you. One is how is money created today? The second one is what is money creation funding today? And how can it be redirected? So I'm just going to pause briefly to look at the chat here and see if there's anything we need to address before we go on. Yeah, that's a good question. I can provide the list of references. You could also put in the chat here your email address, and I can send those afterwards. Yeah. All right. So here's a question. Did you know that in the United States, the banking sector creates and adds more than $21 trillion per year to the money supply? So remember that 1 trillion is $1 million spent per day for 2,500 years. We could pay for a lot of climate solutions with $21 trillion per year. And in Germany, it's more than $2.5 trillion per year. So this isn't just a US thing, and these numbers are really large. That's just one country within the entire EU. Obviously, it's one of the largest economies. But even if you look at smaller countries like Romania, huge amounts of money are being created every year by the banking sector. So what we need to do in our minds is say, wait a minute, and I'll explain more about how that's possible, how it is that banks are creating money like this. But just to say, first of all, that what these numbers I've just told you, these are coming from the Federal Reserve. These are coming from the European Central Bank. Given that it's true that trillions are being created every year, the right question to be asking is not the question that we're almost afraid to ask, which is, could we create money to pay for things? Right? We're being told right now, oh, you shouldn't even ask that question because that's insane, right? But if money's being created all the time, then maybe the question we should actually be asking is, what is money being created for? What should money be created for? And also maybe ask, why are we being told that creating money causes inflation when huge amounts of money is being created all the time, even in periods of low inflation, like the entire decade from 2008 to 2021, right? So these are new questions that we can ask when we understand how money is created today by banks, right? And it's being created all the time in huge quantities. So just to help you feel confident in asking those questions, I want to actually point you to some resources on this topic. And just to say that some of the things that I'm about to tell you, I would not have believed if I had not seen bankers, central bankers, banking scholars saying these things, writing them in publications, and in comprehensive studies. So what are they saying? One thing that they're saying is that banks do not lend out depositor savings. Most of us heard that we put our money in banks set aside a little bit and they lend out the rest. And that's where banks get the money that they're lending. And what these folks are telling us is that that's simply wrong. Banks do not lend out depositor savings in any fraction. So if you've heard the fractional reserve story, it's wrong. Banks newly create 100% of the money they lend. Every time they make a loan, 100% of the money they lend is money that did not exist before. It is being created and added to the economy. Now, that may be shocking to hear. It blew my mind when I first heard it, and it really changed my understanding of how our economy works, because if money's being created and added to the economy at all times in huge quantities, then we ought to have a conversation about what it's going to. And lastly, and very importantly, banks are able to do this because they hold special legal privileges that allow them to do this within regulatory limits, right? And that's really important, as we'll talk about later, because if banks' ability to create money comes from legal privileges that our governments give them to be able to do this, then it means that those legal privileges can be changed. And when those legal privileges are changed, we can get radically different outcomes in terms of what's being funded. Those trillions of dollars can be redirected at the stroke of a pen. Now, I'm not saying that winning the political will to get that pen stroke, on legislative change is easy. As you know, in the United States, some of you, we've really lost a lot of influence over legislation in this country, certainly for progressive things like funding climate solutions. But it's important that we still pay attention to this and understand this aspect of our money system because of how much it's shaping our economy. It both explains kind of what we're up against, but it also does offer potential solutions that are good to socialize with people who are maybe not in power today, but maybe in the future. And also in countries around the world where there are leaders that are interested in figuring out how to pay for important solutions that are progressive and environmental and so on, including countries in the global south that are in significant public debt that can be solved in large measure by these types of solutions. So there's one paper that's on the screen right here called Money Creation in the Modern Economy. It is a seminal publication. It was published by the Central Bank of the UK, the Bank of England. It's one of the most venerable, respected central banks in the world. And that's because, frankly, most of our national monetary systems are based on the Bank of England. It was this system that we live with today, the bank money creation, was propagated around the world during the era of colonization by the Europe, the French, the Dutch, and as you know, the British had the largest colonial system. So if you look at any place on the map and you say, when did this particular way of creating money come into existence? It's when the British arrived. It's when the French arrived. It's when the Dutch arrived, and so on. So the bank, all that is to say that the Bank of England knows a few things about how this system works. And they published this bulletin in 2014, Money Creation in the Modern Economy, that is seminal in the sense it's been cited by 2,000 academic books and articles just in the last 10 years. Because what it does is state very, very clearly that what we've been taught about banks lending out depositor savings is incorrect, and that the way it works is as follows. So it says, this article explains how the majority of money in the modern economy is created by commercial banks when making loans. And what they're saying is that governments and central banks, the entities that 86% of us believe, according to global research survey of 23,000 people, 85% of us believe that it's the government or central bank that's creating the money that we use. Actually, governments and central banks create very little of the money we use. And that's not just in the United States. It is even in countries that are very cash-based, right? So if you look at a country like Morocco, that has one of the highest cash utilizations in the world, many people are in disbelief that it could be that the banks in Morocco are creating most of the money in circulation. After all, they're using dollar bills that have the Moroccan government on it. But it's true. Even in a country like Morocco, governments are not creating most of the money that's in use. So what is the rest of the money? The rest of the money is bank money, also known as bank deposits or bank credit or even private money. So if you're looking at literature, just know that there are a bunch of different names for it, but all of it is just electronic numbers in bank accounts. That is how most of our money exists. And the answer to the question of where does bank money come from is that banks create it, and they create it when making loans. So I'm going to go through this super fast, how do banks create money, because there's a lot to know about it. And if I go too fast, don't worry. Here are two excellent resources for understanding how it works. The first one is a Banking 101 video series published by Positive Money, which is one of those organizations that I mentioned in this growing global movement. It is based on a book called Where Does Money Come From, published by the New Economics Foundation. Also an excellent resource. You can get it online, and it is both of them explain it very, very clearly. So what the Bank of England article says is whenever a bank makes a loan, it creates a deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby creating new money, right? So it makes a loan, and it just opens the bank account, and creates, types deposits into it. Now, I know that sounds incredible, but it's true. So just from the borrower's perspective or the loan officer's perspective, here's how it works. Borrower signs a loan contract. The loan officer types the amount of the loan into the bank software, and the banking accounting software increases the customer's account balance by the loan amount, and it saves the loan contract as an asset of the bank. So the loan contract is an asset of the bank. The deposits are a liability for the bank, meaning that they may have to make a payment, given that they put deposits in the depositor's account. And there's a lot of nuance about that piece. We're told, oh my gosh, banks have to pay out the money they lend, and that makes it really risky. Really not true. Watch that Banking 101 series. As one of my friends who's a banker at one of the largest banks in the world says, we don't think of banking as risky. We think of it as risk management. And it's true. Banks are one of the most profitable, and they don't fail frequently. Outside of particular environmental contexts that happened, such as in the 2008 crisis, which wasn't about individual banks, it was about something that happened in the system as a whole. So importantly to note, in this three-step process, no money is taken from any other account when making the loan, and no central bank reserves are touched, right? So these two stories that are taught in economics textbooks, that banks set aside some money and they lend out the rest, that is not happening. And the idea that they are multiplying up central bank reserves, this is also not happening. What it looks like from an accounting perspective is just that when a bank makes a loan, its balance sheet expands on both sides. So I'm not going to go into accounting here, but just to see what this looks like, this is actually the graphic from the Bank of England's Money Creation in the Modern Economy. And what it's showing you is that if a bank had a certain number of assets and deposits on its balance sheet before it makes the loan, after it's made the loan, it simply has more assets and deposits on its balance sheet. That's it. So obviously, banks are limited in how much money they can create. They can't just stack that up forever. And so what are those limits? The most important limit is the availability of willing and creditworthy borrowers. Banks are not allowed to just create money for themselves or to cover losses, right? They need willing and creditworthy borrowers to create money. And when you hear about the government or the central bank raising and lowering interest rates, what they're really trying to do is very indirectly influence how much money banks are creating by changing how many willing borrowers there are given the interest rate. If the interest rate goes up really high, you might not be so willing to take out that loan for a new house, right? So the availability of borrowers, competition and market conditions. So banks have different strategies for how fast they want to grow, where they want to grow, what market segments they want to lend to, and so on. This limits bank money creation. There are many instances where there are creditworthy, willing borrowers who are trying to borrow from a bank, and they say, we're not really interested in lending in your area or in your sector, and that's a major problem. So third is regulations. So there are regulations that limit banks' ability to grow, capital and liquidity requirements, and just importantly, what does not limit bank money creation, as they explain in these in the Bank of England's paper and in other papers, is pre-existing deposits, and that's because banks are not lending out depositor savings, right? And another one is central bank reserves. This textbook story that central bank reserves limit how much money can be created by the banking sector is not correct. All right. So I'm just saying those things in case you have heard any of those things, and it is difficult to believe. There's research that shows that in order to kind of take this in, you have to hear it at least 3 times. Right? So you'll hear it once from me today. But I've also heard that, and I feel that it's true for myself. It's really important to hear it from the experts in their own voices themselves, because otherwise it can be difficult to believe. So what I want to do is just play you 4 minutes here of video clips. The first one is from the Bank of England. Oops, sorry. And this was actually published. This video clip was published by the Bank of England when they released this paper. And what you'll hear is the Bank of England economist who wrote this paper explaining that banks do not lend out deposit savings. They create 100% of the money that they lend.
Ryland, your article is about how money gets created. We're surrounded here by gold in the vaults of the Bank of England. And historically, in the gold standards, the amount of gold would have been related to the stock of money in the economy. Things are very different now. In the modern economy, where does money come from?
Well, let's start off with narrow or central bank money. As the name suggests, central bank money is determined by the Bank of England and consists of notes and reserves. And in normal times, at least, notes and reserves are determined by the amount of notes that people want to hold or need for their transactions, and the amount of notes and reserves that banks want to hold, given the level of interest rates in the economy. It is not chosen or fixed by the central bank, as is sometimes described in some economics textbooks.
Your article focuses on broad money. What determines how much of that there is?
Well, broad money, which in many ways is a better measure of the amount of money circulating in the economy, includes all the bank deposits of households and companies. And one of the key points of the article is that banks create additional broad money whenever they make a loan. Now, while this is nothing new, it's sometimes overlooked as the main way in which money is created. And it runs contrary to the view sometimes put forward that banks can only lend out deposits that they already have. In fact, loans create deposits, not the other way around.
The second myth that you discuss is the idea that these reserves are then multiplied up into additional loans, and this is what gets the economy going. Indeed, this is the essence of the so-called money multiplier theory of monetary policy and how that stimulates the economy, found in many economics textbooks. How is this account misleading?
And the simple fact of banks having more reserves will not materially affect their incentives to make lots and lots of additional loans to households and companies in the way the money multiplier mechanism that you mentioned would suggest.
Basically, the banks.
Let me just check to make sure. I know you were able to see the captions there. Were you also able to hear the audio? I'm not sure that I checked the audio box when I started the sharing.
I was able to hear the audio, so.
Great. Okay. So there you just heard the Bank of England economist explaining not only how bank money is created, but also clearly saying that the textbooks are not correct, and that banks are, not limited. It is not the case that the central bank has or the government has, total control over how much money exists, and that this is something that's not widely understood. So now that was a central banker. Now I want to let you hear from a banker. This is Michael Kumhoff, and he's going to tell it from the banker's perspective.
Basically, the banks sit there, they wait for deposits to arrive, and if they have enough deposits, they lend them out to somebody else. And that is completely wrong. This is the wrong model of banks, because what happens in reality is exactly the opposite. And I've done this, I'm a banker, I know that that's how it works, and you can read it on many central bank websites, that's how it works. It's that banks, when they decide the economy is good, we are optimistic, we are now making loans, they don't need to wait for any deposits, because when they make a loan, they create the deposit. Right there, banks create money.
Now, banking.
Oh, sorry.
Basically.
So again, what he's explaining, I think you got that one. Let's go on to Richard Werner, who is he's a banking scholar, and he actually said, this is wild that our textbooks are not correct. So let me get here.
Now,
Richard Werner said, this is wild that our textbooks are incorrect. This shouldn't be up for debate. There should be a way to confirm for sure what is the truth here. And he actually went and conducted an analysis of bank accounting software. Like banks, thousands of banks, they don't write their own accounting software. They use software packages that are used by hundreds of other banks. And so he got a bank to allow him to analyze what was happening in the accounting software when banks make loans, and confirmed what the Bank of England is saying here, that when banks make loans, 100% of the money is newly created and is not a process of fractional reserve lending. And importantly, he goes on to say, understanding this could be useful for solving some of the world's problems. So I'll let you hear from Richard. And just so you know, I saw a question here from Dave about, or maybe it was Ken, which is, if what we're taught about lending is wrong, why is it what we're being taught? There are, that is a question I've dug into deeply. There are multiple threads to it. And if you want to read a paper that does a pretty good job of showing some of the history of that, read Richard Warner's paper, Lost Century in Economics. He does trace that the misunderstanding over a number of decades.
Banking actually has not been very well understood. There have been three theories of banking, and they've existed and coexisted for at least the past century. The most dominant one currently is still the financial intermediation theory of banking. And nobody had ever done an empirical test. So I thought, well, since these theories are mutually contradicting, when it comes to the crucial question of where does the money come from when you get a loan from the bank? Well, let's figure it out. Let's do an empirical test. So I did this and published 2014 and 2016 two papers. The conclusion is the financial intermediation theory was rejected. Banks are not financial intermediaries. You may have heard of the fractional reserve theory, slightly older. That one was also rejected. It says that banks lend money out of reserves, and they don't. Financial intermediation theory says they lend out of other people's deposits, and they don't. So the oldest theory was the one that was found to be correct, and that's the credit creation theory, which was known 100 years ago, which is why one of the papers is called Lost Century in Economics. Banks create money out of nothing through the process of credit creation. So banks are special. They create the money supply, 97% in most countries of the money supply out of nothing through the process of what's called credit creation. Now, the recognition of bank credit creation is a game changer to solve many of the world's problems, such as the recurring banking crises can be prevented, unemployment can be solved, business cycles, underdevelopment, depletion of finite resources, all these problems can be solved.
Are the central banks alone?
There's a couple other videos here I don't have time to show you, but one of the most remarkable is the chief economist, monetary economist for here for the Central Bank of Central Banks, which is the Bank of International Settlements, saying that everything I learned in my economics training about money is wrong, and it blew my mind when I got into central banking. So we just answered the question, how is money created today? And then now we're going to talk about what is money creation funding today. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to pause here for more questions, but keep putting the questions in the chat. So over the past 9 years, the world's 65 biggest banks have poured $7.9 trillion into fossil fuels, funding them with loans and underwriting and so on. And this is a fantastic report by Banking on Climate Chaos, which is a coalition of a number of environmental organizations that they crunch the numbers to produce this for us. And it's not just the quantity of money that banks are creating and putting into fossil fuels, it's the distribution, right? So since the Paris Climate Accord was signed in 2016, global lending by banks to the energy sector, 93% of it has gone to not clean energy solutions, and only 7% has gone to clean energy solutions. That was a study conducted by the Sierra Club, Fair Finance International, Bank Track, and Rainforest Action Network. And maybe you say, okay, well, those groups are very biased, so they're skewing the numbers. Fine. Let's say that they were cooking the numbers by double, right? So it's 14%, instead of 7%. Let's just say. But it's not a huge change, right? It's not like it flips the other way around. So in our current system, who has the power to decide what receives funding from new money creation? And the answer is banks. Banks get to decide on the basis of what is most profitable for them. That is literally how our current monetary system works. Money gets created whenever a bank has an opportunity to invest in a loan that is going to be profitable for them. And believe it or not, this has been explicitly, when this system was first created in the late 1600s in England, this was seen as very good. And it is still one of the ways that it's defended today, which is, investment businessmen, they know better where to put money into the economy and invest in economic growth than governments or anybody else. So, having them put in the economy where it's profitable for them, this is going to make our economy grow and be strong and be good. I would strongly contest that on the basis of a lot of evidence and other periods of time in monetary history, and I'll show you a few of those in just a minute. But just to give you an example, one bank, Chase Bank, JP Morgan Chase, lent $430 billion to fossil fuels since the Paris Climate Accord was signed. They are considered the worst fossil fuel financier. So how can it be redirected? How can we redirect this money creation, right? So earlier I told you, this is a powerful lever, many people are saying. And so just think about it this way, just to give you a sense of just how powerful this lever is. Just imagine something, right? Like this year, 2025, it's business as usual. Let's say 93% of the fossil fuel energy sector investment is going to fossil fuels or not clean energy, only 7% clean energy. Just imagine if next year we just flip those numbers for 1 year, right? Next year we're going to do what's actually called for by the science research, which is 86% going to clean energy and only 14% going to fossil fuels. You know that if that happened, next year, we would have a radically different economy. Hundreds of thousands of people would be getting hired into the clean energy economy, getting trained in clean energy. Manufacturing of solar plants and wind turbines would be ramping up like crazy. And people would be moving away from fossil fuel development and pipeline construction and things that are no longer being funded, right? Just to give you a sense of, this system is literally constructing our world. It is literally constructing the communities that we inhabit, the energy systems that we use on a year-by-year basis. We just don't notice because currently every year it's being reinvested the same way it was the year before. But if you could just switch it like that, we would all understand just how critically important this money creation system is for constructing our world. So what if we change who has the power? For example, to publicly accountable nonprofit institutions that maybe are lending not for private profit maximization, but instead for public benefit in line with public policy, right? So right now we have governments around the world that have committed to the Paris Climate Agreement. They're going to try to do everything they can to invest in transition to clean energy. And at the same time, they have given the legal privilege to create money to banks that are driving the economy in the exact opposite direction, right? Our current outsourcing the money creation privilege to private banks is not aligned with our public policy commitments. And many of our legislators and our government leaders, they don't actually know this. They're as uninformed as everyone else. They went to the same economics classes. And we know this because in the UK, the Positive Money Group polled parliamentarians and found that 8 out of 10 of them believed that the government was the one creating their money supply. So the good news is that this transition from private money creation for profit to public money creation for public interest has been made before, and in countries that you might not expect. And it's often a little bit under the hood, which is why there's radical monetary reforms that we could make, complementary currencies and all kinds of things. But what I'm going to show you is some ways that it's been done in the past that's a little under the hood, but makes a huge difference and could be done today in every country, swiftly. So I'm going to tell you about 3 places. One is the United States in the 1930s, starting during the Great Depression through World War II, full employment and funding of social safety nets. Germany, 1960s today, and China's economic miracle from the 1990s to the present. And to understand why it is that these countries were able to do these massive transformations of their economies, you have to understand a Copernican revolution that's taking place in the field of macroeconomics. And it doesn't say that most economists are aware of this. In fact, the reason I call it a Copernican revolution is because after Copernicus discovered that the Earth was circulating around the sun, not the other way around, it took several hundred years for the scholastic community to accept it. Right, so there's resistance to this revolution even within economics today. But what is taught in our textbooks and what most people believe is that the economy is kind of like a box, and inside that box, there's a fixed amount of money created by our government, and we're all just passing it back and forth. This is the circular flow diagram that's literally found in the introduction of most economics textbooks. The truth that to be true just by logic, if it's true that banks are creating money every time they make a loan, then it can't be a closed box. There has to be a faucet, and money's being created all the time. And there's also a drain, which I didn't emphasize in the amount of time that we had, which is that every time you repay the principal on a loan, it simply cancels out the loan contract and the balance sheet of the bank contracts. In other words, the money just goes out of existence. It's only the interest that you pay that remains in the system, right? So we have this flow that's going from lending to loan repayment, and that is spinning the economy. It's also shaping our economy. And that's because banks, every time they make a loan, they're executing lending choices. They're deciding whether or not they're going to lend, to fossil fuels or to renewable energy, to rural economies or to urban economies, to giant corporations or to small businesses, for speculation or for investment in real economic, productivity. And the important thing to understand once you see this system and the relationship between money and the economy is that banks are able to do this because they have an extraordinary legal privilege, which is that they're licensed to issue deposits, right? And what's important about that, again, as I said, is that means that we can change the system, because at the headwaters of that entire system is not banks, it's government. It's a legal construct. Money is a legal construct. It is a legal privilege. And that legal privilege can be changed, right? Is that realistic? Has it been done before? Yes, it is realistic. Yes, it's been done before. Right? So I told you already, I'm going to walk you through quickly 3 examples of this. The first one is the United States from the 1930s to the 1970s. What they did, and you can read about this, I can put some sources in a follow-up as well, is they effectively, during the Great Depression, said, this isn't a great time after the banks have just crashed our economy to be hands-off about what banks are doing. In fact, we need to treat them like utilities, right? We have an electric utility. We don't really want to be hands-off about whether or not they're, providing electricity safely, or whether or not they're, price gouging everyone, or whether or not they're serving communities that are rural, right? We want to regulate them to make sure that they're serving the public interest. We're still going to leave them as for-profit entities, but we're going to regulate them to make sure that they're serving the public interest. And that's exactly what happened. They restricted bank money creation to economically productive lending and blocked lending for risky speculation. The government intentionally made banks keep interest rates low, especially for government borrowing. The banks were obligated to lend to the government at 0.02% interest. In other words, a negative real interest rate. We effectively got paid to go to war and 10x the federal budget in World War II. And the banks were only allowed to lend in specific regions or sectors. And that meant that banks had to invest wisely in growing the economy of their region or sector if they wanted to grow their bank. They couldn't all just pile into the most profitable sectors and neglect the rest of the country. And so what did that look like? One of the things is that the country established 45,000 nonprofit credit unions, particularly in rural and working class communities during that time. Today, that has gone in exactly the opposite direction. We now have, since the 1970s, lost 40,000 banking institutions, including credit unions. We're down to about 5,000.
Sam, not to disrupt your flow too much, but there are a number of comments in the chat, and a couple of questions in the Q&A panel as well.
Thank you so
So
much.
just wanted to make sure you had enough time to address those.
Great. Someone said, right, that they, that this looks like a Ponzi scheme, and how do banks remain profitable if there are no constraints to where and how they lend? As I mentioned earlier, there are constraints on where and how they lend, let's see. I think I have something pretty to make sure. There are no constraints where and how they lend. I'm not sure I understand the question, Dave, entirely, so maybe you could put something else in there. So let's go to Germany now. And Germany, so here we go, look at our picture. We can change the legal privilege. We can decide to regulate banks like public utilities. Yeah. So let's go to Germany now and see an example where they did it a little bit differently. Following World War II, they spun up a huge number of publicly owned not-for-profit banks. In particular, state development banks to invest in real economic industrial capacity, like auto industry and so forth. Cooperative banks that were owned by the steel industry and so on cooperatively, so that they could actually invest, money could be created to invest in their industries in ways that they agreed were productive for their own industry. And then public local banks, which are called Sparkasse. 85% of retail banking in the UK, in Germany to this day, is done by these banks. What's important to know is that Germany has one of the strongest economies in the world, but also it has one of the strongest small business economies in the world. And that's because these local banks are only allowed to invest locally. And when the economy takes a hit globally, they go to their small business and they say, this is a good time for us to create money out of nothing to keep you going. And so they have many businesses that are 75 years old that are the global leaders in their industry, because when an economic hit comes, they don't have to lay off all their staff, sell off all their equipment, and sell off their patents and close down their businesses. They're able to make it through. So the last one I want to tell you about is so here we go. You can actually change out your banking sector. You can bring into competition with your private banking sector a huge number of publicly owned not-for-profit banks that have these specific purposes. And then a last example is China. They have what are state-owned development banks, and that is really basically the entire banking sector of China. And they've done extraordinary things to grow their economy over the last 30 years through money creation. But just to give you one example of how powerful this can be, in 2024, China achieved declining emissions thanks to massive clean energy investment led by state-owned banks. And that a lot of that happened since 2020. And I made the chart a little bit small down there. But in 2020, the government said, we're going to obligate these banks to lend cheaply and preferentially for clean energy deployment. They ended up deploying $1.2 trillion over 4 years. They installed more clean energy than just about the world, more than anywhere else in the world. I think more than the United States and Europe combined. I could be wrong, but something like that. So just to bring this to a finish, here's a legal scholar in the United States saying, we as a public are subsidizing banks. We are subsidizing, in a very important sense, their ability to make private profits. This means that we have the right to press them all the time with respect to the decisions that they're making. And as I mentioned before, one of the reasons that's not happening today, that pressure, is that 86% of us or 80% of us are unaware. But this is a potentially politically salient topic, because when people are simply told that banks create more than 95% of the money supply, 86% of them say, I don't like that. That doesn't make sense to me. And we know, as I mentioned earlier, that this also isn't happening in the political sphere because even national legislators are uninformed. Even people in the financial sector. My father actually worked in the financial sector. I still, it took me a couple of years of talking about before he could fully grasp that this is how our money system works. So I'm just going to conclude by conclude by saying that, one of the things that we can do, even if our political context looks unfortunate, we can share a correct understanding of how our current system works with people, and we can work with people who maybe aren't in power today, but could be in power in the future, or maybe are in power today in countries where more progressive investment in, for example, climate solutions are wanted, and political leaders are asking the question, how can we pay for it? This is the way, or one of the ways, right? Okay, so I'm going to stop there and stop my screen sharing.
Yeah, we got 3 questions in the Q&A panel.
Great, thank you. Okay, great. A couple of comments saying this was very helpful. Thank you. Excellent. I'm glad to hear that. And yes, can we put the reference to the lost century in economics in the chat? I can do that. Just so you know, it's really easy to find. If you just Google lost century in economics, I'm pretty sure it comes up as certainly if you go to Google Scholar and Google lost century in economics, it'll be the first thing that comes up. The same with money creation in the modern economy. If you just Google money creation in the modern economy, Bank of England, or put it in Google Scholar, it'll be the first thing that comes up.
Sam, would it be easier if I read out the 3 questions to you? There's a separate Q&A panel.
Oh, okay.
Chat.
I'm so sorry. I've been looking at the chat the whole time. I'm really sorry about that. Yes, credit unions are also creating money. Absolutely. And they can be a super important part of the solution because they're creating money not for profit, for the public interest of their local region, or at least their member community. And unfortunately, we're losing them right and left, but we could absolutely go back in the opposite direction and spin up tens of thousands of them. A question, has the fact of banks creating wealth or money always existed? No, actually, this is a pretty novel way of creating money in the 5,000-year history of human societies using money. In fact, no one knows of an example of it before 1694 in England. And how it came about is really quite interesting. Basically, the king had just been deposed. There was a parliament, and the parliament basically said, we don't want to give the king the power to create money, or rather we want to take that away from them, but we don't really trust democracy either, because the democracy could become too democratic. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to outsource it to businessmen who are going to know where to put money in the economy. And it worked. It made the economy go boom, because all of a sudden there was an effectively unlimited amount of money for any activity that could create money, that could make a profit. Whereas before, you could have a lot of unemployed people, you could have a lot of resources available, but the two wouldn't get together because there was a relatively fixed money supply. And that was a big change. So there's something good about it, but there's also something not good about what we're doing. Like, it doesn't really make sense to not create money. When there's certain situations like, labor, resources, and ideas could get together and make the world better. Why should we allow a shortage of imaginary counting units to stop those things from happening? Why not create the money, right? In my community, we have unemployed youth. We have elders who need care. We have hospitals, world-leading hospitals that could certainly train them how to do that. It's not happening simply because there aren't monetary counting units with which to pay for them to do it. So there is something good about having a money supply where we can grow it and create things. How does this interface with modern monetary theory? Modern monetary theory has done a really great job of introducing the idea of that, hey, we can create money. Modern monetary theory also really emphasizes government money creation. It is true that when governments deficit spend, the economy results with more money in it. But that's really because what the government is doing when it deficit spends is it's borrowing money from banks. It's selling bonds to banks in the primary dealer market. And that results in money being created the same way if you and I take out a mortgage from a bank, that produces more money in the economy, right? So I would say that it is not still the government creating the money, it's the government is a really large borrower that creates money. So that's a different emphasis because it puts the emphasis on the legal privilege to create money that banks hold versus the government's ability to borrow. I hope that makes sense. The last one is, could you comment on the American Monetary Reform Act, AMRA, promoted by the Alliance for Just Money as a proposed solution to democratize money creation? Sure, I can, Greg, good to see you in here. The American Monetary Reform Act is a piece of legislation proposed by the Alliance for Just Money, which would take away the privilege of banks to create money entirely, and would put it entirely in the hands of the central government legislature, which is the United States Congress. And Congress would decide how to create the money or what to create money for, and would also automatically give some of that decision-making authority. About 25% of the money created would be given to states to allocate. I'm a fan of money being created by governments without debt, without borrowing it into existence the way MMT says we could do. At the same time, I'm actually not a fan of centralizing money creation in the hands of the United States Congress or any central government. I think it's extremely important that it be at a much closer level to the local level, which is what our research shows people want. In fact, most people, when we give them a number of options, they say their local government is who they wish was creating the money supply. Yeah. Awesome.
All right,
that's
Sam.
all the questions.
Thank you so much. That is all the time we have for the session. I think people have to get to other sessions as well. Yeah, thank you so much. And we've made a recording of this session, and that'll be made available to all attendees in due course. Thanks and goodbye.
Wonderful. Thank you all for attending. I really